Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. Mrs. Gresnik's beef. Following the defeat of Alboros Dogface and the Dogopolitan army at the Battle of Gresnik's Cut, the goblins resumed their raids on the cattle of those Dogopolitans farming the lands at the foot of the Goblin Downs. Realizing that they were not going to receive any protection from Dogopolis, the farmers determined that they themselves would defend their own property, and, in the event, they did so very successfully. The farmers made sure that they and their peasants always had weapons to hand. The pastures were regularly patrolled by armed groups of farmers, organised on a rota system, who would immediately set on any goblins that they encountered, while raising the alarm so that those in the surrounding area could come to their aid. The result of these precautions was that cattle raiding became a dangerous, indeed often fatal, business, and the goblins largely desisted from it. But not all of them. Gresnik was a famous goblin cattle raider. In fact, he was so famous that he had nothing to prove, and after a couple of encounters with armed and angry Dogopolitan farmers, he had decided that the benefit of cattle raiding was no longer worth the associated risk. But Gresnik's wife had different ideas. She had developed a taste for roast beef, and the goblins only raised mutton. And, while none of his fellows would have dared to accuse such a famous and ferocious goblin as Gresnik of cowardice, she had no compunction in doing so. Now, any other goblin who mocked Gresnik in this way would not have been long for this world. But Gresnik applied different standards to his wife. She lived on, and her tongue wagged on. And so it was that Gresnik regathered his band of cattle raiders and descended once more from the Goblin Downs. Gresnik had 5 companions. Brak and Radik carried bows. The mail-clad Jovan wielded a great 2-handed axe. Kalinik was also armoured and carried a shield and a great spiked club. Fleet-footed Vonko had no armour, but from behind his sheltering shield his axe struck nimbly at his foes. Gresnik himself wore a coat of mail and carried an ornate war-pick. He bore no shield. Instead, he had a stout staff to lean on. He was getting on a bit, and his sciatica was playing up again. The goblins located a likely-looking farm, which stood alone amongst patches of woodland. Behind the farm buildings was a large field, thronged with cattle. The goblins crept unobserved into a stand of trees by this field. The midday sun beat down. The goblins waited and watched. There was no one to be seen. Gresnik gestured, and the goblins crept forward to the forest edge. Again they waited, and then emerged from the woods, silently sliding up to the wall of the field. Gresnik and Vonko waited at the wall, while Brak, Jovan and Kalinik climbed over it into the field. Radik moved along the edge of the field most distant from the farm buildings, bow at the ready. And then the silence was broken by a loud shout. The goblins had been spotted by one of the farmers' patrols. This patrol consisted of 3 men. It was led by Ankus, carrying a sword and a large shield. He was accompanied by 2 men with smaller shields, Nocles, who wore a short sword and carried a fistful of javelins, and Mytildes, who was armed with a sling. Crying the alarm, the patrol immediately charged straight at the goblins, and in particular at Radik, who was the goblin nearest to them. Brack and Jovan moved to support Radic, while Gresnik and Vonko now clambered over the wall into the field and started to herd cattle away from the action up toward the farm buildings and the exit. Radic loosed an arrow at the Dogopolitans rushing toward him, but he shot wide. As the arrow flew past his ear, Myrtildes ceased his advance, steadied himself, and hurled a slingstone at Radic. His aim was better. That was the end of Radic. Nocles and Ancus charged on toward Brack, who had come up to the edge of the field, from where he also shot arrows at the onrushing Dogopolitans. But the goblins were not shooting straight that day, and his arrows too went wide. And now Jovan arrived, swinging his axe at Nocles, who was on the other side of the wall. The axe did not find its mark, but Nocles decided that discretion was the better part of valour, and withdrew to what he considered a safe distance. Ancus, however, did not withdraw. He took Nocles' place and exchanged blows with Jovan over the wall. Meanwhile, Vonko had left off herding cattle and come to join the fray. He vaulted the wall and charged down the cowering Nocles. These two encounters did not go well for the goblins. Nocles gathered himself sufficiently to cut down Vonko, and Ancus ran Jovan through. But Ancus did not glory in his victory for long. Even as he withdrew his blade from Jovan's corpse, a goblin arrow finally found its mark, and Brack shot him dead. While the fight was raging behind them, Gresnik and Kalinik had driven a group of cows up toward the farm buildings. But even as the leading cows reached the field gate, there was another cry, and 4 more Dogopolitans came running out of the farmhouse. These new combatants were led by the farmer, Astakos, resplendent in full armour, carrying a shield and heavy javelin, and wearing a short sword at his side. He was accompanied by 3 of his peasants, who were brandishing pitchforks, scythes, and the like. The names of these men are not recorded in the histories that have come down to us, but this is not surprising. History is written by the rich, who have time on their hands to waste on such idle endeavours, and do not concern themselves with mere peasants. Astakos ordered his unarmoured peasants to climb over the wall into the field and charge towards Gresnik and Kalinik, while he followed in his armour at a safe distance. At this point, Gresnik decided that facing the scorn of his wife was preferable to being pitchforked to death. Demonstrating impressive agility for a middle-aged goblin with sciatica, he ran away, vaulting a wall in the process. Kalinik followed his example and lumbered behind him. Brack was also assessing his options. Although he had seen to Ancus, he was still faced by Nocles and Myrtildes, and decided that it was time to move on. He turned his back on his opponents and ran up the field toward the farm buildings. He was stopped in his tracks by the sight of Astakos peasants before him, in full pursuit of Gresnik and Kalinik. Brack reached into his quiver, pulled out an arrow and nocked it. He drew his bow and released the arrow, which flew straight and true. One of the peasants stumbled and fell, and did not get up again. The foremost peasant had now scrambled over the wall and caught up with Kalinik, who was thus cut down from behind. And now both remaining peasants were hot on Gresnik's heels. Gresnik turned to face his foes, swinging his war-pick at the nearest peasant, who deftly sidestepped, and, in turn, swung his scythe at Gresnik. But Gresnik had stiffened up again after leaping the wall, and was not agile enough to dodge this incoming blow. And that was the end of Gresnik, the greatest goblin of the age. Brack had observed this. He also observed that he was the only goblin left standing. As one of the peasants recrossed the wall and started moving menacingly toward him, he fled back to the hills. Mrs. Gresnik never did get her roast beef.